The Black Sea. 1986. The Soviet guided missile cruiser Slava cuts a silent, dark silhouette against the pre-dawn gloom. The air is cold, heavy with salt spray. On the bridge, the mood is one of focused tension, not of combat but of the hunt. Radar operators scan their glowing green scopes, their faces illuminated by the pale light. Sonar technicians listen to the deep, underwater murmur of the sea. This is a routine surveillance mission, a game of electronic cat and mouse played against their American counterparts across the horizon. Suddenly, a quiet alarm pulses. A young lieutenant's voice cuts through the hum of equipment. Contact. Airborne. Bearing 270. Low altitude, very low. Officers crowd around the radar screen. A tiny, flickering blip appears, representing an object skimming the waves at an impossible 50 feet. They track it, calculating speed vector. It is a flight profile unlike any aircraft. Then, as the Phantom approaches a clutter of rocky islets on the radar return, it simply vanishes. The screen shows empty sea. Confusion spreads. Minutes later, far beyond the islands, the blip reappears on a new course, as if reborn from the terrain itself. On the bridge, seasoned admirals exchange a silent, profound look. The intelligence reports were true. The Americans had unleashed a weapon that could not be seen, a spear that could fly beneath their gaze, vanish, and strike a target 1,000 miles inland. The rules of the game had just changed. This technological specter, the BGM-109 Tomahawk cruise missile, would become an obsession for the Soviet High Command, a baffling challenge that redefined their greatest fear, an attack they could not stop because they could not find it. To understand the depth of Soviet bafflement, one must first grasp the naval doctrine of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Unlike the United States Navy, built around global power projection and aircraft carrier supremacy, the Soviet Navy of the late Cold War was designed for a singular existential purpose: the defense of the motherland. This was the doctrine of Fortress USSR. Its bastions were the shallow, confined seas, the Barents, the Baltic, the Black Sea, the Sea of Okhotsk. Here, beneath and upon these waters, the Soviet Navy would create impenetrable defensive shields to protect the nation's strategic heart. Its ballistic missile submarines, the Boryevi of their day, hiding in the icy depths, and the coastal approaches to Leningrad, Murmansk, and Sevastopol. The primary threat to this fortress was the U.S. Navy's carrier battle group. A floating city of air power, capable of launching scores of aircraft to strike deep into Soviet territory. For decades, Soviet strategy was clear: create layered kill zones. Long-range maritime patrol aircraft like the Tu-95 Bear would hunt the carriers. Submarines, from the roaring diesel-electric boats to the new, quieter nuclear-powered Akula class, would lie in wait. Surface action groups centered on formidable cruisers like the Kirov class, armed with dozens of long-range anti-ship missiles like the P-700 Granite, would engage from over the horizon. Their entire sensor and command network, land-based radar, satellites, shipborne systems, was engineered to detect high-flying bombers or large radar-conspicuous carrier groups. The battle space was conceptualized in two dimensions: the sky above and the sea below. But in the early 1980s, a third, unsettling dimension emerged from American weapons labs. It was not a high-altitude bomber or a towering warship. It was a small, pilotless aircraft 20 feet long with stubby wings. It flew not at 30,000 feet but at 50. It was not supersonic but subsonic. Its radar signature was minuscule. Its name was the BGM-109 Tomahawk Land Attack Missile, or TLAM. Conceived in the 1970s as a strategic nuclear weapon, its potential was radically expanded with conventional warheads. It could be launched from a submerged submarine hundreds of miles offshore, or from a destroyer's vertical launch system. Once fired, it would not head for a ship. It would turn inland. And according to scattered, alarming intelligence reports, it could navigate autonomously across a continent, using a black box technology the Soviets only vaguely understood: terrain matching. While Soviet admirals were masters of the blue water chess game, this was a new piece that moved in a way the rules did not account for. Its development coincided precisely with a bloody, grinding land war that had sucked the USSR into a quagmire far from its fortress seas, the mountains of Afghanistan. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979 was, in the Politburo's view, a limited border operation to stabilize a fraternal communist government. A swift surgical strike. Instead, it became a decade-long drain, a bleeding wound, as General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev would later call it. For the United States, it was a strategic opportunity. President Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, saw it clearly: Now we can give the USSR its Vietnam War. The CIA, in partnership with Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence (ISI), began funneling weapons, money and training to the disparate Afghan resistance factions, the Mujahideen. This proxy war was fought with Kalashnikovs, mortars and Stinger missiles in the Hindu Kush. But in the corridors of the Pentagon and the Kremlin, it was part of a global confrontation. Every weapon system sent to Afghanistan was weighed for its broader message. When the Mujahideen began using effective, man-portable anti-aircraft missiles, it signaled to Moscow that its control of the skies, a cornerstone of Soviet military doctrine, was now contested. Concurrently, in the United States, a revolution was underway. The advent of the microchip and advanced computing was birthing a new generation of smart weapons. The Tomahawk was their vanguard. Its genius lay not in its speed or size but in its brain. Prior cruise missiles like the early Soviet designs were essentially flying torpedoes. They flew straight and dumb. The Tomahawk was different. It was programmed with a detailed digital map of its intended flight path. Using a system called TERCOM, terrain contour matching, the missile would periodically compare the ground beneath it, measured by a radar altimeter with the 3D map in its memory. If it drifted off course, it would correct itself. In the final terminal phase, an even more precise system called DSMAC, Digital Scene Matching Area Correlation, used a small camera to compare what it saw with a stored photographic image of the target area, allowing for pinpoint accuracy. It could fly a pre-programmed, circuitous route of over 1,000 miles, twisting through valleys, skimming hills, and arriving at its target with a circular error probable of just tens of feet. For the U.S. Navy, this was a transformative capability. It meant that any surface ship or submarine equipped with Tomahawks could now strike high-value, heavily defended inland targets, airfields, command bunkers, industrial complexes, without risking a single pilot or aircraft carrier moving within range of Soviet coastal defenses. The first operational Tomahawks were deployed aboard the USS New Jersey in 1983 and on Los Angeles-class attack submarines. In the Soviet Union, fragments of this data began to coalesce into a troubling picture. The GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence, and the KGB Scientific and Technical Directorates pieced together reports of a new long-range, low-flying U.S. missile. Their initial assessments were likely tinged with disbelief. How could a missile navigate autonomously for such distances? How could it avoid mountains? It defied their understanding of guidance technology. Yet the evidence mounted. Satellite imagery showed peculiar test ranges in the American desert. Electronic intelligence ships, the converted fishing trawlers bristling with antennas, picked up strange new telemetry frequencies. The admirals of the Red Banner Northern and Black Sea fleets, guardians of the fortress, now had to consider a phantom that could, in theory, slip past every radar fence they had built, fly up the valleys of the Dnieper or the Volga, and disappear into the vastness of the Soviet interior before detonating on the steps of the Kremlin itself. The war was in Afghanistan, but the shadow of a deeper, more direct threat was taking shape over the motherland's coastline. This sets the stage for the multifaceted shock the Tomahawk delivered. The Soviet confusion stemmed from a fundamental clash of technological paradigms. Soviet missile design, from the Scud to the Granite, prioritized brute force. Massive warheads, high speed and robust, jamming-resistant radio command or inertial guidance. They were sledgehammers. The Tomahawk was a scalpel, and its guiding principle was not power but deception. Its primary method of vanishing was brutally simple. It flew under everything. Soviet early warning radar networks, both land-based and shipborne, were designed to detect targets against the clean backdrop of the sky. Their physics were defeated by ground clutter. The chaotic radar returned from terrain, buildings, and waves. By maintaining a flight altitude of 50 to 100 feet over water, and often even lower over land, the Tomahawk disappeared into the radar noise of the Earth's surface. To a Soviet radar operator, it was indistinguishable from the churning sea or the rocky ground. A ghost in the machine. But flying low is useless if you cannot navigate. This is where TERCOM performed its magic. Before a mission, Defense Mapping Agency data was used to create a series of digital elevation maps for a corridor along the missile's planned route. These maps were loaded into the Tomahawk's computer. In flight, the missile's radar altimeter would fire a rapid series of pulses straight down, painting a precise profile of the ground beneath it. This live profile was then compared to the stored map. It wasn't looking for a specific tree or building. It was matching the contour of the land itself, the unique fingerprint of a hill valley, a ridge, a riverbank. Once a match was confirmed, the missile would correct its course and then fly inertially to the next TERCOM checkpoint. This process happened automatically, without any external signal that could be jammed or detected. For Soviet electronic intelligence, this was a black box. They could detect the faint pulse of the radar altimeter, but it was a brief, sporadic, and highly directional emission, pointing straight down, not towards their sensors. There was no continuous radio beam for homing, no telltale signature of an active seeker scanning the horizon. The missile was, for all intents and purposes, electromagnetically silent and invisible for the vast majority of its flight. It didn't just fly under the radar, it flew under their entire conceptual understanding of guided weaponry. From the perspective of the Soviet Main Intelligence Directorate, the GRU, the Tomahawk represented an intelligence failure of the highest order. Their network of agents, technological espionage, and treaty-allowable monitoring was world-class, yet this system seemed to emerge almost fully formed. The challenge was multidimensional. First, there was the challenge of seeing it. Soviet AGI's auxiliary general intelligence ships, like those of the primary class, shadowed U.S. naval exercises relentlessly. They would have detected launches. The solid rocket booster plume from a ship-based launch was unmistakable. But following the weapon's flight was another matter. After booster separation and wing deployment, the small turbofan engine would engage, and the missile would dip to the wavetops. On the AGI's radar scopes, it would drop from a clear track into the sea clutter and vanish. Their only confirmation would be a distant explosion at a target range that was alarmingly far inland. They could measure the effect but not the process. Second, there was the puzzle of its deployment. The missile could be launched from two radically different platforms: surface ships and submerged submarines. A submarine launch was the ultimate stealth delivery. A Los Angeles-class boat could fire a Tomahawk from its torpedo tubes while lurking off the Kola Peninsula, and the first sign of attack for Soviet Northern Fleet commanders would be the warhead detonating at a naval airfield hundreds of kilometers south. This meant the threat axis was no longer just from visible battle groups on the horizon. It was from any patch of ocean at any time. The GRU's reports back to Naval High Command would have been filled with frustrating qualifiers: believed to, estimated capability, likely employs. They had fragments, stolen technical manuals perhaps, imagery of test missiles, signals intelligence of test frequencies. But the core secret, the reliable software-driven fusion of TIRCM and DSMAC, remained inside shielded American microprocessors. For the Admirals, this was intolerable. They were used to quantifying threats. A carrier has 80 aircraft, a submarine has 24 missiles. But how do you quantify a phantom? How do you build a defense against a weapon whose primary tactic is to not be seen until it is too late? The frustration in the intelligence summaries would have been palpable, leading directly to the human tension on the bridges of the ships tasked with finding this elusive weapon. On the bridge of a Kirov-class battlecruiser or in the underground command post of the Black Sea Fleet, the Tomahawk threat transitioned from an intelligence curiosity to a command crisis. For a Soviet admiral, his authority was built upon a comprehensive situational picture. A vast tactical map updated by radar reports, sonar contacts, and satellite data. His decision to commit a squadron of backfire bombers or order a salvo of SS-19 shipwreck missiles was based on this godlike view of the battlespace. The Tomahawk systematically dismantled this picture. Imagine the moment relayed by a nervous junior officer. Comrade Admiral, the Cresta 2 shadowing the U.S. Task Group reports a launch. 1. Possibly 2 airborne contacts. Bearing confirmed. Altitude falling rapidly. Contacts have merged with sea clutter. We have lost them. The Admiral's eyes would shift from the tactical display to the vast, physical horizon. Out there, somewhere in that empty gray expanse, a weapon was now flying towards the coast of the motherland. His powerful radars were useless. His fighter interceptors, designed to climb and engage high-altitude bombers, had no way to find a target flying below their own radar look-down capability over land. His surface-to-air missiles, the formidable SN-6 launchers, required a target track to guide. He had been rendered blind at the very moment his purpose, to defend, was most critical. This produced a profound psychological shift. It was a humiliation of technology and a violation of tactical dogma. The Admiral was no longer a chess master moving pieces. He was a man standing in a dark room, knowing a venomous serpent had been let loose somewhere on the floor. The fear was not just of the weapon's explosive yield, but of its certainty. If it could navigate 1,000 miles over land to hit a specific building, what target was safe? The emotional anchor for these men was not panic, but a cold, deepening dread mixed with professional fury. Their entire careers, the billions of rubles invested in their fleets, the complex dance of Cold War deterrence, all of it was suddenly called into question by a small, slow, stupidly simple-looking missile. The threat was no longer just to ships at sea, but to the inviolability of the Soviet homeland itself. This leads to the ultimate chilling angle, the strategic recalculation forced upon the Soviet General Staff. The Tomahawk, particularly in its nuclear-armed variant, TLAMN, was not merely a new weapon, it was a potential instrument of a disarming first strike. Previous models of nuclear war planning centered on the ballistic missile trajectory, a high, arcing path from silo or submarine that provided 20 to 30 minutes of warning time for the Soviet early warning satellites and over-the-horizon radars. The Tomahawk presented a parallel, silent track. Launched from submarines lurking just outside Soviet territorial waters, a volley of nuclear Tomahawks could fly a nap-of-the-earth profile across Finland or the Baltic states, or up the river valleys from the Black Sea. Their flight time to strategic command centers in Moscow, Leninsk, or key ICBM fields could be comparable to a ballistic missile, but they would offer zero strategic warning. There would be no fiery plume from a booster stage for satellites to see. No high-arching trajectory for radars to calculate. They would be tactical weapons with strategic effect, blurring the line between battlefield engagement and Armageddon. For the Kremlin leadership, this was the core of the bafflement. The Admirals' tactical problem, how to shoot it down, was secondary to the Politburo's existential problem, how to maintain credible deterrence. Mutually assured destruction relied on the certainty of a devastating second strike. If the U.S. could, in theory, eliminate the Soviet political and military leadership, along with key communication nodes, in a surprise attack using invisible weapons, the foundation of Cold War stability crumbled. The Tomahawk, therefore, was not just a naval weapon. It was a geopolitical lever, a silent pressure point that amplified the Soviet sense of technological inferiority and strategic encirclement at the very moment their conventional forces were being bled in Afghanistan. The accumulation of these angles, technological, intelligence, command, and strategic, created a pressure cooker of concern within the Soviet military establishment. This pressure would seek release, not in a single battle, but in a relentless, global hunt for answers, culminating in moments of stark, operational confirmation. The turning point was not a single detonation, but a creeping tide of confirmation. It was the slow, agonizing process by which suspicion hardened into certainty, and theoretical vulnerability became a quantified, inescapable threat. This climax played out in classified briefing rooms in Moscow, on the electronic warfare decks of Soviet spy ships, and in the analysis cells of the KGB's Directorate T. The first concrete data streams came from the relentless shadowing of U.S. Navy exercises. Soviet AGIs, like the asterisk SSV-516 Pribaltica, documented the increasing frequency of Tomahawk test launches from the late 1970s into the mid-1980s. Each test filled in a piece of the puzzle. In 1981, during a major NATO exercise in the North Atlantic, monitoring stations likely detected the distinctive low-altitude profile and terminal accuracy of a test shot, confirming the weapon's operational viability. The Soviets learned to recognize the launch signature, the bright, short-lived infrared bloom of the solid rocket booster, followed by the quick descent to ultra-low altitude and the subsequent radar fade-out. Then came the geographical shock. Initially, Soviet analysts may have assumed the missile's terrain-following ability was limited to relatively flat, open terrain or predictable coastal approaches. This assumption was shattered by intelligence on U.S. test ranges in Nevada and at the Naval Weapons Center at China Lake, California. Satellite imagery and possibly human intelligence revealed that the Americans were testing the missile over some of the most rugged, complex topography on the continent, simulating flights over the Caucasus or the Urals. They weren't just building a coastal strike weapon, they were building a continental penetration weapon. The Turcom system wasn't a crude aid, it was robust enough to guide the missile through mountain passes and along river valleys with terrifying reliability. A critical moment of technical revelation likely occurred around 1983 to 1984, with the operational deployment of the Tomahawk anti-ship missile, TSM, and the new Block II TLAMs. The TSM variant employed a more sophisticated active radar seeker for terminal guidance, but it was the conventional land attack variants that posed the greater strategic puzzle. The deployment of the first Tomahawk-capable submarines, the USS Guitarro and others, meant the launch platform could now remain hidden, adding a layer of profound uncertainty. Soviet naval intelligence would have tracked the modifications to these vessels, the installation of the weapon control system and the dedicated vertical launch system tubes on surface ships. Each modified hull was a carrier of a new and unsettling capability. The most potent confirmation, however, came from outside traditional military channels. The KGB's scientific espionage apparatus, one of the most effective in the world, went into overdrive. Operatives in Europe, Japan, and the United States itself were tasked with acquiring anything related to microprocessors, digital mapping, and precision guidance. While they likely failed to steal the complete Turcom software, they almost certainly procured sample chips, technical papers on correlation algorithms, and commercial mapping technologies that hinted at the missile's capabilities. This intelligence would have landed on the desks of the Central Committee's Defense Department, providing a technical foundation for the fears voiced by the Navy. The Phantom was being given a schematic. By 1985 to 86, the mosaic was complete enough for a definitive assessment. The Soviet Navy now understood the full scope of the threat, a survivable, long-range, all-weather, day and night precision strike system that could be mass-launched from platforms they might never detect, against targets they considered secure. The weapon had vanished from their radar screens only to reappear, with devastating clarity in their strategic planning documents as a first-order threat. The era of assuming geographic sanctuary was over. The final, unambiguous proof would come not from espionage, but from direct, harrowing observation at sea, where theory met the cold reality of the waves. The theoretical became undeniable in the crowded, tense waters of the Mediterranean and Black Sea. Here, the Soviet Navy maintained a permanent presence, shadowing the U.S. Sixth Fleet in a daily ballet of surveillance and counter-surveillance. It was in these confined seas that the Tomahawk's capabilities were finally witnessed in their full operational context, leaving Soviet commanders with no room for doubt. One of the most significant incidents likely occurred during a U.S. Navy exercise in the central Mediterranean in the mid-1980s, possibly Ocean Safari, or a similar major NATO maritime exercise. A Soviet Kashin or Kresta II-class destroyer, along with its ever-present AGI Shadow, would have been positioned to monitor the exercise area. The U.S. task force, centered on a carrier like the USS Forrestal, would have conducted a scheduled Tomahawk test firing. The Soviet observers would record the now familiar sequence: the launch flare, the descent, the radar fade. But the destination of this test shot was critical. Instead of a sea target or a remote coastal range, the missile would have been programmed to fly a long, circuitous route over land, perhaps across a section of Italy or a Greek peninsula, before impacting a designated target site. For the Soviet shipborne radars, the missile truly vanished after launch, only for the AGI signals intelligence suite to later intercept the U.S. Navy's exercise communications confirming a successful impact hundreds of kilometers inland. This was the moment of truth. It was one thing to read a report about a test in the Nevada desert. It was another to sit on a bridge in the Mediterranean and know that a U.S. missile had just flown over a NATO nation's sovereign territory, navigating autonomously through complex terrain, completely invisible to your sensors, to strike a precise point. It demonstrated the weapon-esque capability in a theater of war. The political message was as clear as the technical one. The U.S. could launch such weapons from the relative safety of international waters against targets deep within the Warsaw Pact, from the Balkans to the very borders of the Soviet Union itself. Simultaneously, in the Black Sea, the home waters of the Soviet fleet, the threat took on a more intimate and alarming character. The USS Karen, a Spruance-class destroyer, and the cruiser USS Yorktown began making frequent freedom of navigation operations close to Soviet territorial waters in the late 1980s. These ships were equipped with the armored box launcher systems for Tomahawks. While they never launched in the Black Sea, their presence was a deliberate demonstration. Soviet coastal defense radars would have painted these ships, knowing they carried, within their steel hulls, weapons that could fly up the Danube Delta or across the Crimean Plains to hit Sevastopol, the fleet headquarters, or the strategic bomber bases in Ukraine. The weapon didn't need to be fired to have an effect. Its mere presence on a platform that could steam to within 300 miles of the coast altered the entire defensive calculus. The cumulative weight of these observations, the Mediterranean test, the provocative deployments in the Black Sea, the stream of technical intelligence, coalesced into a definitive turning point for the Soviet High Command. Sometime around 1986 to 1987, the Tomahawk transitioned in official Soviet military classification from an interesting new development to a critical asymmetric threat. The bafflement of the Admirals turned into a cold, focused anxiety. The question was no longer, how does it work? But, how do we stop it? This shift in thinking triggered an immediate and frantic response, a reallocation of national resources and a rewriting of naval doctrine that would define the final years of the Soviet Union. The period of passive observation was over. The era of reactive, desperate countermeasures had begun. The Soviet military-industrial complex, when confronted with an existential threat, could react with formidable, focused energy. The Tomahawk shock triggered one such mobilization. The response was not a single silver bullet, but a sprawling, multi-layered effort to rebuild the shredded perimeter of Fortress USSR. The first line of defense had to move inward. The most immediate and visible shift was in air defense. The Soviet Navy and the National Air Defense Forces, PVO Strany, initiated a crash program to counter low-altitude cruise missiles. This meant a radical enhancement of look-down/shoot-down capability. The workhorse MiG-31 Foxhound, already a formidable high-speed interceptor, received upgraded radar systems like the Zaslon M, improving its ability to pick small, low-flying targets out of ground clutter. More importantly, the focus shifted to airborne early warning, AEW. The existing Tu-126 MOS was obsolete. The new Bereev A-50 mainstay, based on the IL-76 transport, entered service with urgency. Its powerful Schmel radar, housed in a giant rotodome, could, in theory, detect low-flying targets at a greater range than ground-based radar, vectoring interceptors to the general threat axis. It was a stopgap. The Tomahawk's radar cross-section was still a nightmare to track, but it was a necessary one. On the ground and aboard ships, new sensor systems were prioritized. Low-altitude surveillance radars, some using higher frequencies better suited to picking out small, fast-moving objects against clutter, were deployed along likely approach corridors, river valleys, mountain passes leading to strategic sites. The Soviet Navy accelerated development and deployment of its own cruise missiles, like the 3M54 caliber, later famous as the SSN-27 Sizzler, which also featured a low-altitude, terrain-following final approach. Understanding the enemy's weapon drove innovation in their own, though Soviet guidance initially relied more on pre-programmed inertial navigation with active radar terminal homing, lacking the deep, autonomous TERCOM capability. The strategic allocation of resources was telling. Faced with the grinding war in Afghanistan and President Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, the Soviet economy was under unprecedented strain. Yet, funds and scientific talent were diverted to this new defensive problem. Design bureaus like NPO Almaz Air Defense Systems and NPO Mashinostroyenia cruise missiles saw their projects gain new urgency. The psychological impact on military planning was profound. War games at the Voroshilov General Staff Academy now had to incorporate a new, dismal scenario, the bolt from the blue cruise missile strike that could decapitate command and control in the opening minutes of a conflict, before the strategic nuclear forces could be mobilized. This frantic defensive scramble, however, could not conceal a deeper, more demoralizing truth. For decades, Soviet military doctrine was offensive in nature, a deep, unstoppable thrust into Western Europe. Now, a significant portion of its most advanced resources was being pulled back for homeland defense against a single, small, conventional weapon system. The Tomahawk had successfully turned the Soviet Navy's gaze inward, forcing it to protect its own shores rather than challenge American control of the open ocean. It was a silent, strategic victory for the United States, achieved without firing a shot in anger. But the ultimate validation of Soviet fears, and the final chapter in this technological confrontation, would be written not in the secret memos of the General Staff, but on live television, in the skies over a distant desert nation. The opening hours of Operation Desert Storm on January 17, 1991, served as a brutal public audit of Soviet naval intelligence and defense planning. As the world watched on CNN, the first shots of the war were not from infantry or tanks, but from the decks of U.S. Navy warships in the Red Sea and Persian Gulf. USS San Jacinto and USS Bunker Hill launched the opening salvo, 52 Tomahawk cruise missiles streaking toward Baghdad. Video footage released by the Pentagon showed the missiles navigating with eerie precision through the urban canyons of the Iraqi capital, striking the Ministry of Defense, communication centers, and power plants. The weapon the Soviet admirals had studied in secret for a decade was now the star of a global military broadcast. For the remnants of the Soviet High Command, the USSR would formally dissolve in December of that year. It was a moment of grim vindication and profound defeat. Every characteristic they had feared was on display: the launch from distant, safe waters, the long, low-altitude flight over featureless desert, the pinpoint accuracy against hardened targets. The Phantom had materialized on television screens with devastating effect. The reports from their own military observers attached to the Iraqi forces, or from satellite reconnaissance, would have confirmed the weapon's fearsome efficacy. Iraqi air defenses, modeled closely on Soviet systems, were utterly helpless. The Tomahawk had a mission success rate estimated at over 85% in that conflict. The Soviet Union's own imminent collapse made the technological lesson even more bitter. They had correctly identified a revolutionary threat, but their lumbering state and bankrupt economy had been incapable of mounting an effective counter in time. The long-term legacy of the Tomahawk shock reshaped global military strategy. First, it cemented the concept of standoff warfare. Why risk a pilot or an aircraft carrier when a missile launched from hundreds of miles away could achieve the same effect? This philosophy now dominates modern conflict. Second, it sparked a global proliferation of cruise missile technology. Russia, inheriting the Soviet research, perfected its own family of long-range, low-observable cruise missiles like the Caliber and Kh-101, which it has used extensively in Syria and Ukraine. A direct, evolutionary response to the American advantage they once dreaded. China studied the lessons of Desert Storm obsessively, leading to its own massive investment in advanced anti-ship and land attack cruise missiles like the YJ-12 and CJ-10, creating the core of its anti-access/area denial (A2/AD) strategy designed to keep U.S. carrier groups at bay. For the U.S. Navy, the Tomahawk became a staple, the go-to weapon for presidential strike options. Its operational debut was a resounding success that validated decades of investment and justified the massive network of satellites, digital mapping and precision guidance that enabled it. The missile itself evolved through successive blocks, gaining GPS guidance, improved warheads and two-way satellite data links for in-flight retargeting. The Vanishing Act was enhanced with stealthier airframes and more sophisticated routing software. The final, ironic blowback from the Soviet-era investigation lies in modern Russian military doctrine. Their current emphasis on long-range, conventional precision strikes against an adversary's critical national infrastructure, power grids, command nodes, railway hubs, in the opening phase of a conflict is a direct mirror image of the threat they perceived from the Tomahawk. They sought to build a weapon that could inflict the same paralysis they feared. In attempting to defend against the scalpel, they learned to wield one themselves. Thus, the voyage that began with a baffled admiral on the Black Sea Bridge ended by altering the fundamental tools of power projection and homeland defense for every major nation on Earth. The Phantom had not only been seen, it had been duplicated, feared, and ultimately, woven into the very fabric of 21st-century warfare. The story of the Soviet admirals and the vanishing Tomahawk is more than a Cold War technological anecdote. It is a parable about perception, and the fragility of military doctrine when confronted with a paradigm it cannot see. For centuries, naval power was measured in the thickness of armor, the caliber of guns, the visibility of a ship on the horizon. The Tomahawk rendered those metrics obsolete. It introduced a new grammar of warfare, where the most potent weapon was not explosive yield, but certainty, the certainty of arrival, the certainty of precision, the certainty of coming from an unseen quarter. The Soviet Union's bafflement was, in its essence, a failure of imagination. Their fortress was built against the threats they understood: the high-flying bomber, the towering warship, the ballistic missile's fiery arc. They mastered the physics of detection for objects in the empty sky and the deep sea. The Tomahawk exploited the forgotten margin in between, the complex, cluttered, electromagnetically noisy interface of earth and air, the final few hundred feet where radar becomes blind. It didn't break their technology, it sidestepped their entire sensory worldview. This confrontation underscores a timeless principle in the evolution of conflict. Advantage flows not always to the strongest, but to the one who redefines the battlefield. The Tomahawk did not win a war, but it successfully changed the rules of the next one before a single shot was fired in anger. It forced a superpower to spend itself into further strain, to look nervously inward, to doubt the sanctity of its own borders. In doing so, it demonstrated that the most significant victories of the late Cold War were not won in the mountains of Afghanistan or the halls of summits, but in the silent, digital corridors of software code and terrain databases. Today, as advanced militaries grapple with the next revolution, hypersonic glide vehicles, autonomous drone swarms, and AI-driven warfare, the lesson of the Tomahawk endures. The ultimate vulnerability is not a gap in armor, but a gap in understanding. The weapon that baffles, that vanishes and reappears where logic says it should not be, achieves a psychological effect far greater than its blast radius. It sows doubt in the minds of commanders and planners. It forces a nation to defend against shadows. In the end, the story of the Admirals and the Phantom missile is a reminder that in the endless contest between shield and spear, the most dangerous spear is the one you never see coming.